The sole purpose of the community is to eradicate burnout from the inside out. It's not only about looking at the external signs and symptoms, but it's really about having a personal relationship to the way you work, the way you think, how your shaping forces have contributed to behaviors such as overworking or people pleasing.
You're listening to the Woman of Value podcast. You are about to hear the story of a woman who is following her dreams and passions and creating positive change in the world. My guest today is Teresa Vozza. She is an award-winning leadership expert, a keynote speaker, a writer, and the former Chief Human Resources Officer for a Fortune 500 company. She's on a mission to help executive professionals eradicate burnout and transform their leadership. Her thought leadership can be found in many of the top 2% podcasts, such as Wickedly Smart Women and Leaders of Transformation. And of course, the Woman of Value podcast, which is the most awesome of all, along with leading magazines like Collective World and Women of Influence. Welcome to the podcast, Teresa.
Thank you, Sandy. It's a pleasure to be here.
What does Woman of Value mean to you?
I was so excited for this question because even just the words Woman of Value just gives me shivers. But I would say, for me, the words that really stick out when I hear that is embodied, self-agency, and integrated. And I can break down what I mean by each one of those things. So embodied for me is when we lead our lives as well as our leadership from a place of deep congruence. Like there's an alignment with what we say and we do. Our values are actually played out in daily interactions. So embodied to me is very much a whole body style of leadership. It's not just cognitive. It's not just head-based. Self-agency, the second component that I think is so important, is when we are in full command of our voice. And for me, being in full command means that my desires, my thoughts, my actions are coming from a place of authenticity and of resonance, like deeper resonance. And integrated, I spent so many years in the executive space, Sandy, and I kind of grew up with this belief that personal and professional were to be separated. And I think that belief did me a disservice, and I'm sure we'll get into that when we talk about leadership story, but I don't believe that we live as separate selves. I believe that separation creates a conflict and a feeling of constrainment that separates us from leading effectively and authentically. So when I say integrated, I'm thinking about leading from a place of in being relationship to our whole being. So the way I act at work, yes, there may be some differences stylistically, but who I am is the same person as when I go home. And I don't think, and I learned this throughout my own story, that we just shut off and that we become someone else when we go through the door. I think that shutting off is what creates a lot of constriction and pain, especially in the work that I do with executives who feel that distinction doesn't jive with their lives. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I love everything that you said. This is a very different kind of answer than I've usually gotten. I mean, some of the same values and ideas, but I think that so many people don't know how to be authentic. They separate themselves from in different parts of their lives. And as a dating and relationship coach, I see a lot of people who separate their lives out in the dating world. They become this representative of who they are. There's somebody at work, and there's somebody in dating and relationships, and there's somebody in certain friendships. And when we can really integrate and become one and really show up authentically, which is more about uncovering all the stuff that got in the way than changing who you are, right?
So
And
true.
that's the work. I mean, it's like we adapt our personalities to fit in for so long that to be bold enough to be ourselves can be a challenge.
I love that you said to be bold enough to be ourselves, because I do think there's this courage that's required. You know, we were talking earlier just before the call started about boundaries, and that's what I think about when it comes to setting any type of guardrail or limit to what we will and will not do or be or say, is that it requires a certain amount of self leadership and courage to embrace discomfort. And so I think that's a really important point that you make.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think when you know yourself well, and not everybody really has taken the time to
Mm,
understand their values and who they are, but when you
mm,
do know yourself, and then you can take a stand for who you are by
mm,
setting those boundaries and protecting the
yeah,
integrity of who you are, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So agree.
Yeah. Well, let's take us back to the first time where you started to discover your value. And
Mm,
I mean, you can share more than one moment, but I know that it's really helpful for our audience to understand that people don't just
mm,
come out of the gate as really successful people. It takes a minute to get there, and it takes
yeah,
some awareness. So tell us about that first moment.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for asking. Whew. I have a couple stories, but the one that really sticks out for me is 2015. So in 2015, I was working as a chief human resources officer for a very successful Fortune 500 company. And I was recently promoted to vice president of HR at that time. And I'll never forget the moment I I was going into an interview with my CEO at the time, the individual who had tapped me on the shoulder to work alongside him. And in that interview, I remember feeling a lot of panic and a lot of growing anxiety. And there was this feeling of burning in my chest. And of course, when you don't know what you're dealing with, the first thought is that something terrible is happening. I really thought at that time in this interview that I was having a heart attack. And here I was, newly promoted. I just started working with this new CEO, and I had to excuse myself from the meeting. And as I did, I fell to the ground. And I had what I now know as a major anxiety attack. At the time, I didn't know that that's what it was. And so, a whole slew of events had to occur in order for me to be safely transported to the hospital. But that required a stretcher coming into the office. My CEO he did not know what to do. He was obviously very flabbergasted by the event. I had colleagues looking at me as I was being carried out in a stretcher. I was so embarrassed, Sandy. And I wish I could tell you that my health was the number one concern, but it wasn't. My number one concern being wheeled out of there was, what will they think? And that incident brought me face to face with what was a deep childhood wound, if you will, which was anxiety and covering up this overachievement part of my personality, if you will, with overworking and pleasing and saying yes to everything. And it actually became a real moment of reckoning for me, because I had realized through that process that I was actually running away from and drowning a lot of my childhood pain in overworking and over identifying with other people, specifically men in leadership. And it really brought me to my knees, is the easiest way I could describe it. And that became a catalyst for a major transformation in how I went on to continue my leadership legacy before I started my business. And it really brought home the importance, again, as I was sharing earlier, that the personal and the professional sometimes or many times can't be separated, because in that case, a lot of that trauma and a lot of those covered up pains, if you will, childhood things, were working themselves out as I was leading a company. So I don't know that many leaders know this, or maybe they're coming to terms with that. I certainly see it more so now, that wherever you go, there you are. And so even as a leader, if you're dealing with childhood pain or trauma, it shows up in behaviors, and so much of it is unconscious. And I know you have a background in coaching, and you went to CTI, which is where I did my study as well. And that childhood wounding, that family of origin belief systems, I call them shaping forces, really do play a large role in your life, and in my case, because I'm an executive coach, in the executives' lives. It shows up. So for me, I'm super passionate about really uncovering conditioned tendencies, those things that are automatic, that almost like start to become scripts that we operate out of. And I'm also really obsessed with showing leaders how to transcend those, because that was such a large part of my story.
Thank you for sharing that. I can actually relate to the whole panic attack and the suppressing. And I had something similar, but it was in my marriage. I had lived my whole life kind of suppressing my needs and not realizing the toll it took. And I think we kind of, continue on, and we can overperform and overdo and be there for everybody and not realize what we're suppressing until it comes out in these horrible ways. And you used it as a catalyst for change and transformation, but a lot of people will have these reckonings. They will have major health concerns. They'll end up in the hospital. They'll have a mental breakdown, and then they go right back to the life they had. And so I give you a lot of credit for seeing it for what it was, and for using it as a catalyst and transforming the life that you led so that you would be more embodied and alive and self-actualized, authentic. This is, I think it's important for people to hear that this doesn't have to be the way of life, that you can actually look at crisis and look at these kinds of things as a wake-up call.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. And thank you for sharing that about yourself as well. I think whenever women come together and share their stories, I think that's so incredibly powerful. And one of the things that I know, but that I had to learn, is that at the end of the day, no matter what people want most is a sense of feeling like they're not alone and that they belong. And belonging could be to a community, it could be belonging to, or in a relationship, but it's more important is that sense of internal belonging. And when I hear you share about the panic attack that you felt, and I think about the anxiety attack that I had and continue to have at different points for at least a good year after that event, once I learned that this was not necessarily some default or defect in me, that it was in essence a result of a response, a stress management response to life's events, I felt like that was how it became a catalyst. And, what I hear sometimes is that's just the way I am. And when I hear things like that, I'm always so struck by wanting to ask, well, what if it's not? What if it's not just how you are? Because I thought that too. I'm just a high achiever, high performing, type A woman. And I use that as a crutch to cover so much of the deeper questions.
I agree with you so much. Something that I learned when I took the positive intelligence course, it's actually a course that was created for coaches by a coach. I think he was also a CTI graduate, and he created a program to help people get to their highest self. And he took the saboteur and divided it into 10 different character traits. And one of them is the hyperachiever. One of them is the overly analytical person, the people pleaser. These are all saboteurs. And we think of saboteur as the inner critic, which it is. That's the overarching. But it was such an eye-opener for me to take this course, because I realized that when you can really pinpoint that hyperachieving and controlling and people pleasing are all sabotaging us, because they're compensatory skills that we learn to survive in the world when we weren't, maybe our feelings weren't acknowledged, when we weren't really appreciated for who we were, but for what we did. We do more of that. And it's a quick way to achieve success, is to get that PhD and be the CEO of a company. And then what? And it takes a toll. It takes a big toll on people to just be at that level of hyperachievement, because you have to take care of yourself. And I think the older we get, the more we see the results of not taking care of ourselves. You can see it in people's posture. I mean, I've watched people become more hunched over, gain weight. Their bodies change when they're not taking care of themselves.
Yeah. It's so interesting you should say that, because I've been really fascinated lately with somatics and really understanding the role of the body and how to use that when we coach. And so much of the literature and what I'm learning and observing, both in my clients and even in myself, is how we take for granted things like bracing. You know, when our bodies brace and like we're holding on to some tension, or like you said, slouching, something I do very now, like I'm doing it right now, although I'm in a very uncomfortable chair. But it's those types of things that actually give us information. And I don't know about you, but I was not as bodily aware as I am now especially in the last couple of years, where I've studied this more and incorporated this into my practice, is how much the body is communicating to me at all times, and how hugely beneficial this would have been to me as an executive. And so now being able to incorporate that, so it's not just a health benefit, although that's super important, but it's also a way of gathering information and being able to discern important decisions, is by understanding how your body reacts to direction A or direction B. It's very powerful stuff.
I personally agree with you. I love somatic healing. It's hard for people to even pay attention to their bodies and what's happening in your body. And so a lot of my work also is very somatic. It's, because I think also our bodies tell us the emotions we're feeling before we actually have the words for them. And if we can just say, what are you feeling in your body? I did a whole exercise on fear, and using your body, but also like each time I say a word around fear, like I am afraid, feels one way in your body. I feel fear is another way in your body. I'm aware of fear, feels differently in your body. I welcome fear, feels differently in your body. And so to go from I am afraid to I welcome fear, and going through those shifts and feeling each one can make a huge change in how we process emotions and how we let something encompass us and just take us over, rather than feeling it through and being able to really work through difficult emotions.
And I love that you bring in the nuance of language. Like, I love that you changed the statement just a little bit each time, and then asked individuals to feel that in their body. Because I'm such a huge believer in the power of words, and language is something I am, what's the right word? I think my husband says persnickety, like just very, very fussy about. And so I pay attention to things like that. And you're right, even as you say those tiny differences in words, the reaction can be entirely different.
Yeah, I am also very persnickety about words because our words matter. I mean,
Yeah.
if we can remember when somebody said to us, "You're stupid," or "You're
Mm,
not going to amount to much," even if they were not capable of doing
mhm.
better, it still has a great impact on us. And just changing a few words. I mean, so many people are afraid to have tough conversations because they don't have the language. And so
Language. Yeah.
language matters,
Yeah.
body, feelings matter,
Yeah.
all those things.
Yeah.
If you have ever played small to make other people feel comfortable, or maybe stayed in a bad relationship or job too long because you didn't think you could do any better, I wrote a book for you. It's called Becoming a Woman of Value: How to Thrive in Life and Love. Each of the 30 chapters contains a life lesson, a story, and an exercise to bring you closer to reaching your full potential. Becoming a Woman of Value is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. Give us more of a
Hmm.
profile of who you are out there
Yeah.
in the world.
I'm an executive coach and an HR consultant. And so what does that mean? Like, what am I actually doing today? So there's a couple different arms to my business, maybe a bit similar to yours as well. So I have a group coaching program, which is specifically just for women leaders. And in that program, we call it the Crucible, which every time I say it, I love it because it is a transformational group coaching program. And the sole purpose of the community is to eradicate burnout from the inside out. So it's not less about, but it's not only about looking at the external signs and symptoms, but it's really about having a personal relationship to the way you work, the way you think, how your shaping forces have contributed to uh, behaviors such as overworking or people pleasing. And so that's where we do a lot of work specifically around what I like to call self or sustainable leadership. I think sustainable leadership for me is where you are able to lead even at the highest levels and lead from a place of integration and embodiment. So, four key dimensions that I am really passionate about in that program is agency, self-regulation, really getting in touch with desire and vision, as well as behavioral agility. And so that's a big part of my work. And the second part of my work is both private practice, so one-to-one, but also organizational work. And this is where I do a lot of work with CEOs and executive teams on the topic of resilience, which is becoming one of the most fastest growing needs of organizations today. And I know that there's been a bombardment of resilience trainings, workshops, leaders, and so on. I'm quite in love with HeartMath, which is an organization where I was trained. And that's an organization that's dedicated to showing CEOs and corporates the importance of resilience on productivity. So really getting into not only the science of resilience, but then how to incorporate this within organizational settings. So I've been doing a lot more work on that topic within organizations. And besides resilience, a lot of work that I do is in reference to women in the workplace. So topics that are really popular are sponsorship, mentorship, and what does that actually mean for women, and how do we get a sponsor? How do we get a mentor? What is the difference? How do we actually do this within organizations? So it's not everything, but those I would say are the bigger pieces of my business. I guess the thing that I would just bow tie that with is that I'm obsessed with cultivating heart-centered, sustainable leadership teams. And I think that the world is desperately crying for it. And I'm seeing it in organizations because the war on talent is so tight. And so many more people are opting out. And the reason is because the meaning economy has taken over, especially since the pandemic. People have choices. They do not want to stay in a workplace where meaningful conversations are not being had. So I try to provide a pathway for leaders to do that, while at the same time not impacting their productivity, and in fact, if anything, improving their productivity and their engagement metrics.
Wow. Your values certainly come through everything that you say and everything that you do. And I can really hear so much alignment with your value system in the work that you're doing for so many people. It's so valuable.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate that.
It's, as a person who's worked for herself most of her life, I really look from the outside at the dysfunction of so many organizations and how many people waste time in meetings that are meaningless, that do work that's meaningless.
Yeah.
My daughter worked for a big company that I just would look at. It was like a national company, and my son also worked for a national company, international company. And you would look at, like, their mission statement said one thing, but the actual work was completely different. There was very little room for upward mobility. They didn't really care about individual creativity and what people really had to offer. You had to just put your head down and do the work and not get paid so well. And so it was just really terrible. And the meetings were ridiculous. The leadership was not monitored. I mean, that would suck my soul out of my body. And they ended up both leaving their jobs because of that. So it's knowing that we have choices also as entrepreneurs. You know, for me, that gave me so much creative freedom of being able to design my life and live within the integrity of what I wanted to create. But it's so important within corporations to be able to help people really show up.
I'm really glad you brought up the word choice, because I think what holds so many of us back, whether you're in corporate or you're an entrepreneur, but I see it a lot in my work, is when people feel trapped. When people feel a sense of being trapped in their job, whether that be golden handcuffs or that be, you know, in some cases in a relationships, that leads to this inertia, this sense of stuckness that, left unchallenged for too long, leads to things like what I experienced, like what you experienced with a panic attack. And I think so much of the undoing if you will, within executive coaching is showing individuals that we're not trapped and that there are pathways. And then how do we change by change, small steps? I'm a big believer in micro changes, help people see the possibility to do so.
Yeah. Yes, 100%. The book I just published this past year is called Choice Points in Dating, and it's all about empowering people to make healthier choices. And the funny thing is, you use the word trapped, and that is the name of the speech about my panic attack. So we must be channeling each other.
I know that feeling well. I do. Yeah. But good choice of words.
Yeah, no, it is how most people feel when they don't know what the choices are. And then when you give them the tools and the choices, and slowly, step by step, they make big changes, and it's incredible to watch and to witness what is possible.
Yeah.
So speaking of possibility, let's talk about the future. What's your dream for the future, Teresa?
Yeah, I love this question. I didn't really think about this when I was preparing to speak with you, but I think what really comes to mind for me is, you know, on a very macro scale, very, very broadly speaking, I would say that to create a leadership model or even a life model, I think again, both are in my mind integrated, is that if we can remember that each and every person has a story, and when we can recognize that all of us have been shaped by forces that in many cases have been beyond our control, whether that be the environment or the institution or the culture or the religion that you were brought up under, whatever that shaping force is, when we can, whether you're a part of a team or you're a CEO of a company or you're an individual contributor or you're dating, can remember that every person you encounter has a story, I think the way we communicate with one another would change radically. And I see that playing out so much in corporate. I was gonna say corporate America, but I'm in Canada, but I do work in the US as well. So I'll just say corporate everywhere. Is just changing the face of language, of really understanding how to communicate in a coherent way and how to communicate from a place of being deeply centered, being deeply grounded, and applying that wise discernment in how we relate to other people. I think this is where I'm going in, even in my business's future, but even just from a heart-centered, heart-fueled mission way, is to create organizations that can communicate to each other coherently and with a deep understanding of shaping forces. And I think once we do that, we have the power to create really magical teams that do great things and outstanding individuals that make wonderful choices for their life. And I think that's what's going to lead to not only inner transformation, but I think organizational transformation as well. So right now, I would say the biggest thing for me in the future is really deepening my understanding and organization's understanding of what that coherent communication framework looks like and how that can make you so much more effective as an individual and as an employee.
Is there something you can share quickly that our audience can benefit from? Just a kind of a quick tip about communication and boundaries.
Yeah, I'll say two things. So one, I think boundaries are wonderful. And I do think that the absence of boundaries is what has led to so many, I think, problems in the world and problems in leadership and just in people's lives. However, boundaries alone, without a deeper understanding of what our needs and values and desires are, tend to fall flat because we're not believing what we're trying to say. So I think one of the things that I try to offer my clients as a really quick tip is the next time you are face to face with a request or even a colleague or a conflict that creates a disturbance within you, whether that is a reaction of anger or indifference or irritability, just pause 3 seconds. If you can just count from 1 to 3 in a very slow way, like 1, 2, 3, that is just enough time for your system to get back on track and choose a response that is more in alignment with who you really are versus, the parts of you that come out when under pressure. Because this is the thing, when one of the things I've learned in HeartMath is about the energetics of communication, and coherence is when our heart, mind, or emotions are in alignment. So if we walk into a room and there's tension, it can be felt. And so there's been studies done that, when you walk into a room and you are the one coming in with that calm or practicing that 3-second pause, you're actually helping the others in the room co-regulate. So they respond in time. And so I think that just that small, I don't like the word hack, but I'll use it just because it's easy and people understand it. As coaches, I'm not so fond of hacks. I'm fond more of real deep change, but it is a technique that when practiced over time is just enough of a pattern interrupt that might help you manage your reaction and therefore your communication.
Thank you for sharing that. The power of the pause is great. And I think if everybody just stopped for a second, for 3 seconds, we would have much less reactivity. And you know who you are, you know what you stand for, you have your values clear, like you said before, then you set those boundaries, and you can feel really harsh and like you're overreacting or you're not being kind enough. But if you're really clear, when I didn't have clear boundaries and I didn't know myself well, I had the wrong clients. I had people who disrespected constantly because I never showed them what I needed, and I didn't vet properly. And so, but I wanted to go back to what you said about this is a good learning experience when it happens to us. If we are reactive, to look back and ask ourselves, what's the trigger here? And where did it come from? When did I first feel this? Asking yourself those powerful questions and realizing this isn't necessarily something this person did to me. It's my reaction is very strong under these kinds of circumstances. What's the need that's not being met? I mean, when we can really look at the granular level, we can really start to heal.
I agree with you, Sandy. I think turning everything into an inflection point or a reflection point to just ask yourself, I always like to say to myself, what's getting wounded here? What is getting triggered? Because almost always there's something. And if I can tap into that, then I feel like the relief is not too far away because I realize it's something that I can do something about.
Yeah, which gives us our power back.
Yeah.
Which is very important in life.
Agreed.
All right. Well, let's move on to the lightning round. Are you ready?
I was nervous about this one, but I'll do it.
You can do it. Okay. No overthinking here.
Okay.
The first one is fill in the blank. I used to think I wasn't blank enough.
Smart.
It's amazing how many people have that one.
I know.
What was the number one thing holding you back from becoming a woman of value?
Insecurity, not feeling like I knew how to be a woman of value.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of overachievers are people who think they still need to know more in order to be an expert in something. And it's like, I have had clients like this who, should I take another course? Should I read another book?
Oh
should I go get another degree?
Yes,
no, you should not do those things.
So glad you said that. So glad you said that. And for me, it's a big part of it is that perfectionism. If it's not met with a 1000% yes from the other person, then I feel like something is lacking, or I should say I felt. I don't really go there today, but before that was a big deal.
It's a lot of pressure to put on yourself.
Yeah.
Boy.
Yeah.
No wonder the pressure cooker couldn't take it anymore.
Right? I know. Again, hindsight.
Yeah, exactly. But good learning. What is the best advice that you can give to a woman who wants to become more empowered?
Start small. I think sometimes we tend to want to boil the ocean, to use that expression. I feel like agency, self-confidence, becoming a woman of value starts with teeny tiny actions that we take on a consistent and repeated basis. One of my favorite teachers from a long time ago said to me, consistent, repeated action and embodiment, becoming emotionally involved with the goal or the desire of what you want, are the two prerequisites for change. And you don't need to do grand things. It's small, repeatable action. So if that means a 3-second pause, I can do that. And if that means waiting 20 minutes before responding to an email, I can do that too. So just starting to think about all those teeny micro actions you can take to step into your sense of power.
Such an important thing to remember, because I see with my clients, they look at the top of the staircase instead of each step, and they go, "Oh, I'll never get there." Right. And it's those small steps that take you there. You don't need to see the top. You don't need to be at the top right away, and you can't be. And it's that overwhelm of I'll never be good enough. I'll never have that level of expertise. And I remember when I started podcasting and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm a complete fraud. I'm an imposter. And it was not even called a podcast back then because it was 10 years ago. It was like an internet radio show. And I made tons of mistakes and I felt like nobody was listening, but I stayed consistent. And 10 years later, it's a popular podcast. It's one of the number one ways people find me. And that was my goal. It was my why, was get known and also get to know experts in my field, because that has given me so much. So it wasn't just get my voice out there because I'm so important. It was like find people to learn from and grow with, and then I can bring all of that to clients, which is value added. And so it's just been an amazing experience. But I didn't know that when I started. I was shaking, like, who's going to listen to me? And,
Yeah.
obviously
Yeah.
nobody. Right?
And now a
So,
lot of people.
yeah, exactly.
Right?
But you
So,
can't know that. And
no.
the times when you want to quit because you don't see that instant
Yeah.
reaction from people, but then you just keep going because it's doing something. And so you just, those little steps.
Yeah. And you said something, and I heard this from one of your guests as well, but it bears worth repeating, is I think certainty can really paralyze people, like wanting certainty that they're making the right decision, wanting certainty that they need to move on to another job. And I think if we're so hyper focused on certainty, we will not make momentum. We will not move. So starting to dismantle the need to be certain and instead start to embrace the need to take small steps and wait and see. And consistency, I love that you said that word. It's one of my favorite words. Consistent action on a daily basis leads to increased conviction. And so that certainty may or may not come, but I think if that's the goal, we won't do anything. So we don't want that to be what traps us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
Yeah. Yeah.
What advice would you give to your younger self?
You're never going to be alone. And I think that's so important, because if the pandemic has taught us anything,
Mhm.
is that we crave community and we crave being around people. And believe it or not, I'm an introvert. Most people wouldn't say that about me when I come on these types of interviews, but I love being alone. I get my energy from being alone. And not but, and I learn from being in the good company of others. And I gain energy also from being in the company of other women or men as well that are like-minded and on similar paths as myself, or even completely different paths where I can learn something from them. So I do think that getting out of the isolation and understanding that you have people around you who are here to help you and walk alongside you is gold. And if I had known that when I was young, I felt alone a lot of the time, I think that would have made a difference.
Yes. So I think you might have just answered the next question, but let me ask it
Okay.
anyway. What is something that people get wrong about you?
Now I feel pressure to choose a different answer, but I would say I will use something different, because I get this a lot from people too. Is you seem like you always have it together. I get that a lot because I do a lot of keynote speaking, and I'll tell you right now, Sandy, I am nervous for every single talk that I do. And people will say to me, "It sounds so natural. You're like a pro. You don't even think about it. Like you seem so put together." And I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. I worry just as much as the next person about my talks. I get anxiety. The difference is that I have resources that I've created for myself, and coaches have helped me create, and great therapists to use when I'm experiencing those emotions under pressure.
I totally can relate to all of that
Yeah.
too, because
Yeah.
I was the worst public speaker and I work very hard at speaking in public. And I push myself to do it all the time. But I
Yeah.
remember when I did my TEDx talk and I had zero public speaking experience, but got this opportunity. And I hired a speech coach and I joined Toastmasters and I got feedback from people and I put myself out there, even though I would have these recurring dreams that I'm going to get up on stage and make a fool out of
Yeah.
myself and
Yeah.
forget everything.
I
Just,
know. I know.
yeah. So, people will see you, they'll see the you that's worked on yourself and think you have it all together and you don't get nervous and you're so confident. But it's such an important thing for people to hear, that they
Mm.
can get resources, that they don't have to be
Mm.
limited because they worry or have anxiety about speaking in
Mm.
public, that you
Mm.
don't want to silence your voice because you're afraid.
Yeah, and Sandy, I want to acknowledge you for a moment, because I think one of the things I've noticed about you, even in just the last 50 minutes or so, is you share your story and you're sincere in sharing your struggles, and I think that's such an important piece of coaching. I think all great coaches, not only do they get coached, but they also share their learnings as well with their clients and in different platforms. And I have found that by me telling my story and showing my vulnerability, that has humanized me and it endears people to want to work with me. And I believe that's probably the same for you, is that you have this sincere, relatable, and open approach to not only how you coach, but how you've overcome your own challenges. And I just want to acknowledge you for that.
Oh, thank you. Well, your stories have
Yeah,
inspired my stories. I
thank
do
you.
think that it's also a misconception that many of us have, that we have to appear perfect to be hired by
Yeah,
people and to be respected.
yeah.
And I personally agree with you that the people I've respected the most are the ones who are not afraid to show their humanity,
Mm,
because perfection is not humanity. That is some
yeah,
perverted expression
yeah.
of humanity that we believe we have to be, and that leads to more people feeling stressed and I have to be
Yeah,
perfect. So the
yeah.
ability to make mistakes, to make your mess your message, make your I mean, to be inspired by the things that we grow from,
Mm,
share personal examples. I mean, so many of my clients have said it really helps me to hear stories. It helps me to
mm,
see how other people have overcome issues.
yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I shared a story today about my daughter
Mm,
with a client who was struggling, and my daughter, who's notoriously shuts down under pressure,
mm,
and I can't get through to her. We had an incredible breakthrough this week, and she was open. She appreciated my honesty and my pushback. And she said, I wish more people would be honest like you. And I was like, who is this person? But it didn't, it didn't happen overnight. And when people are notoriously difficult to communicate with, we
mhm.
can't shut ourselves down when they shut down, especially if
Yeah,
they're a big part of our lives and we're, a child,
yeah,
a spouse,
yeah.
it's the work that we put in to
Mm,
stay present with them,
mm,
to say, I've said to her many times, I'm just asking you a simple question. I just want
mm,
one simple answer. Can you give me that? So the shutdown starts to dissolve. I'm your friend, not your enemy. It's those kinds of
yeah.
things where here's my intention in this conversation. I'm not attacking. And then over time, again, baby steps, that person starts to trust you more, starts to open up more, starts to appreciate. So yeah,
It's
I
a
think,
beautiful, beautiful story.
thank you. I'm
Yeah.
celebrating. I mean, this
It's
is
a
huge.
huge thing. I know I feel the same about my son, but we don't have time for that today, but another time. But I hear you. Holding space for him and showing him I'm there has been the best parenting I've been ever able to give him. Is And as coaches, we know that, right? Holding space and our presence is
Hmm.
in and of itself a huge way of relating to our children.
Yeah, and patience,
Yeah.
seeing the
And
big
patience.
picture
Yeah.
and knowing and believing in the potential of who every person is,
Yeah.
that it's there. It's just right now
Yeah.
it's struggling a little bit to come out.
Yeah. 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 I love that.
All right, well, we are at our final question, Teresa, which is the legacy question. How would you like to be remembered?
First word that comes to my mind is real. I would like to be remembered as real. And for me, I guess someone would think authentic, and I would say that's correct, but I think it congruently aligned. And so for me, real is I'm consistent. People can count on me to show up in a way that is aligned not only with my values, but in a way that meets them where they're at as well. And for me, real is honest, and that is coming to you from a place of not only integrity, because to me that's a given, but also a real sincerity in my listening, and a real sincerity in my giving, and a real sincerity in my coaching. I think real to me is so important given just our social media craziness. I think that there's such at least maybe I'm speaking for myself, but there's such a desperation for conversations that are grounded and based on reality versus curated. I think that was the word I was looking for, not curated. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. And
Yeah.
you definitely come across as so real and aligned, and somebody who has worked hard at knowing your values, knowing your value, and being there for other people. So I feel it, and I don't know you for that long, but you definitely are all those things.
Well, thank you. That's a high compliment coming from you, so I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Teresa, can you share one link that where people can find you?
Easiest place would be my website, teresavozza.ca. TERESA, V as in Victor, OZZA.ca.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for coming on the show. I really loved our conversation, and I appreciate your example of who a woman of value can be.
Well, thank you, Sandy. I had such a good time speaking with you, and the work you're doing for women everywhere is definitely noteworthy. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. If you love our show, please give us a high rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Here's to everyone being of value. If you would like to step more fully into your value, grab a free copy of The Ultimate Guide to Becoming a Woman of Value on my website, thewomanofvalue.com. Just click the link at the top of the homepage. And if you haven't already done so, be sure to click the subscribe button in your listening app. And if there's something in this episode that inspired you, please share it with others, because the more we share these inspirational stories, the more women of value we will have in this world. I'll see you next time.